All right, we want to take a detour and talk about the Great Depression in Canada. The Great Depression was a global phenomenon, and Canada suffered significantly. And so this is useful for sort of comparison purposes. In 1928, wheat harvests on the Canadian prairies were much larger than usual. Prices were low, however, in part because of the large harvest, and so much of the wheat was stored in grain elevators. Canadians hoped to sell the wheat to Americans and Europeans later when the price was higher. And the summer of 1929 was very dry and the crop was small that year. But the crop in Argentina was quite large that year, and customers bought the cheaper Argentinian crop, so they didn't get a chance to sell their stock. The crop was also good in Europe that year, so they did not need to supplement with Canadian wheat as usual. The Canadian economy now is more dependent on commodities, things like wheat, pork bellies, lumber, that kind of thing, than is the American economy, both today and even more so in the times of the Great Depression. So this created a great hardship for Canada. The Toronto Stock Exchange crashed on October 29th, 1929, just like the one in New York for much the same reasons. Bankruptcies quickly began to erase jobs. And between 1929 and 1939, the gross national product of Canada dropped 40%. That's compared to 37% in the United States, so it was worse in Canada. Unemployment reached 27% at the depth of the Depression in 1933. That's a little bit higher also than what it was in the United States. Canadian exports, and of course Canada depended much more heavily on exports than did the U.S., Canadian exports shrank by 50% from 1929 to 1933, the worst of the Depression. Worst hit were areas dependent on primary industries like farming, mining, and logging. As prices fell, the deflationary death spiral, and there were just few alternative jobs in a lot of these areas. So families saw most or all of their assets disappear, and their debts became heavier as prices fell. Now, let's discuss the political situation in Canada. You had the two dominant parties were the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, Liberal being on the left, Conservative on the right. But those labels don't necessarily mean what you might think they mean in modern America. Remember that modern American liberalism was really being created by Roosevelt at this time. And you'll recall, however, Wilfrid Laurier was a liberal. And when the Depression hit, it was a liberal who was prime minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King. This is not him, by the way. And you may recall a revolutionary, a Canadian revolutionary back in the 19th century named William Lyon Mackenzie, and William Lyon Mackenzie King is his direct descendant. He was the head of the Liberal Party and was prime minister when the crash occurred and had been for most of the previous 7 years. And so the head of the Conservative Party, Richard Bedford Bennett, but he's just known as R.B. Bennett, it's this guy here, he announced that if elected, he and his government would end the Great Depression and unemployment or, quote, perish in the attempt. King, on the other hand, who was the incumbent, believed that the federal government, Canadian federal government should not have to provide direct relief, believing that provincial governments and cities should care for their own. Of course, the Canadian federal government could perhaps provide some funds, but he announced that he would not give a 5-cent piece, unquote, to any province with a conservative government. Well, so in other words, you're not going to help a government, a whole province of people, just because they have a conservative government and you're a liberal. The statement hurt him in the elections. And so the Conservative Party under Bennett took control of government in elections in 1930. So Bennett came into power, and his plan to combat the Depression was by increasing trade within the British Empire. You'll recall that I think I've mentioned the British Empire at this point. It consisted of about, a quarter of the world. And so his idea was to impose tariffs for imports from outside the empire, but to lubricate and encourage trade within the empire promising that his measures would, quote, blast, unquote, Canadian exports into world markets. This was known as his imperial preference policy. And tied into this was in part the response to Canada's anger over Smoot-Hawley. This is part of the tariff war. But the British Empire is still pretty big. They think, well, we can trade amongst ourselves. Now, by the way, you'll recall the British North America Act of 1867 had made made Canada rather sort of autonomous internally, at least, but still part of the empire. The Statute of Westminster was passed in 1931, which made it autonomous really completely, although still part of the Commonwealth, still technically part of the empire. The monarch was still the head of state. It did the Statute of Westminster did this for Canada and for Australia. Very notably, it did not do it for India. We see some racism there. The success of the imperial preference policy was limited. In fact, basically it failed to generate the desired result, and Bennett had no real contingency plan. His success was also limited by the fact that his own wealth, often very openly displayed, he was very wealthy, and his very impersonal style alienated many struggling Canadians. In the party's pro-business and pro-banking inclinations, this is the Conservative Party, provided little relief to the millions of increasingly desperate and agitated unemployed. Despite the economic crisis, laissez-faire persisted as the guiding economic principle of Conservative Party ideology, not surprising. And Bennett felt that government relief to the unemployed was considered a disincentive to individual initiative, and was therefore only granted in the most minimal amounts and attached to work programs. In this, he was like Herbert Hoover. But nevertheless, there were large numbers of disaffected, unemployed men concentrated in urban centers, and it created a volatile situation. And so as an alternative to bloodshed in the streets, the stopgap solution for unemployment chosen by the Bennett government was to establish military-run and styled relief camps in remote areas throughout the country where single unemployed men toiled for 20 cents a day. These were mockingly called Royal 20 Centers. Any relief beyond this was left to provincial and municipal governments, many of which were either insolvent or on the brink of bankruptcy, and which railed against the inaction of other levels of government. So we're taking the unemployed, some of them, and moving them to these remote areas of this giant country and paying them really, really crappy wages. That's about the best solution the Bennett government offered. Now, predictably, partisan differences began to sharpen on the question of government intervention in the economy, just as it was doing in America. Since lower levels of government were largely in liberal hands, and protest movements were beginning to send their own parties into the political mainstream, things began to get fairly volatile. Notably, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation of Canada and the Social Credit Party in Alberta. These were not unlike some of the schemes from the populist reformers who were protesting sort of the ineffectiveness of New Deal 1. Now, a nickname that would stick with Bennett for the remainder of his political career, Iron Hill Bennett, he got from the 1932 speech he gave in Toronto, in which he ironically, if unintentionally, alluded to Jack London's socialist novel. The Iron Heel by Jack London is not as well known. It was a very early dystopian novel. It's sort of, in many ways, the forerunner of stories like Blade Runner, this future dystopian. And London was espousing socialism in it, but R.B. Bennett sort of misuses it by quoting from it, quote, "What do they offer you in the seed in exchange for the present order? Socialism, communism, dictatorship. They are sowing the seeds of unrest everywhere, right in this city. Such propaganda is being carried on in the little out-of-way places as well. And we know throughout Canada this propaganda is being put forward by organizations from foreign lands that seek to destroy our institutions. And we ask that every man and woman put the iron heel of ruthlessness against a thing of that kind." So he's quoting, saying, hey, you put the iron heel against this thing. Well, obviously, The person saying this in the book, London was speaking against. But reacting to fears of communist subversion, Bennett invoked the controversial Section 98 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Now, enacted in the aftermath of a big strike, the Winnipeg General Strike, Section 98 dispensed with the presumption of innocence in outlawing potential threats to the state, specifically anyone belonging to an organization that officially advocated the violent overthrow of the government. We can just go ahead and lock those people up. Despite the broad power authorized under Section 98, it targeted specifically and predictably the Communist Party of Canada. 8 of the party's top leaders, including a guy named Tim Buck, were arrested and convicted under Section 98 in 1931. This plan to stamp out communism, however, backfired and proved to be a damaging embarrassment for the government, especially after Buck was the target of an apparent assassination attempt. While confined to his cell during a prison riot, despite not participating in the riot, shots were fired into his cell. When a play depicting these events called 8 Men Speak was suppressed by the Toronto police, a protest meeting was held where an activist named A.E. Smith repeated the play's allegations, and he was arrested consequently for sedition for doing so. Having survived Section 98 and benefiting from public sympathy wrought by persecution, Communist Party members set out to organize workers in the relief camps, the Royal 20 Centers. Camp workers labored at a variety of infrastructure projects, including such things as municipal airports, roads, park facilities, along with a number of just make-work schemes. Conditions in the camps were abhorrent, not only because of the low pay, but the lack of recreational facilities, isolation from family and friends, poor food, and the use of military-style disciplines, which made the camps feel a lot like penal colonies. Communists thus had ample grounds to organize camp inmates. The Relief Camp Workers Union was formed and affiliated with the Workers' Unity League. This was a trade union umbrella of the Communist Party. It was led by a guy named Arthur Evans. And camp workers in British Columbia struck on April 4th, 1935, and after 2 months of protesting in Vancouver began what's known as the On to Ottawa Trek, to bring their grievances to Bennett's doorstep. The Prime Minister treated this trek as an attempted insurrection and ordered it to be stopped. This is very similar to the Bonus Army. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, halted the On to Ottawa Trek in Regina on July 1st, 1935, by attacking a crowd of 3,000 strikers and their supporters, resulting in 2 deaths and dozens injured. All told, Bennett's anti-communist policy would not bode well for his political career.